Hey guys, it's Jay Calderon with 12rounder.com here to give you the aftermath for the David Lemieux versus Gabriel Rosado fight that took place at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. Broadcast on HBO. It was a part of a triple header. We'll get to the first two fights on the show. Opened up the telecast with a junior welterweight clash between Tomas Delorme taking on Hank Lundy. I picked Lundy to win, and the fight kind of went the way my overall pick went. While I did pick Delorme to win, as mentioned, it was one of those fights where I felt like Lundy could do enough to potentially swing the fight in his favor, maybe land something a bit hard towards the middle rounds of the fight, or perhaps even hurt Delorme and force Delorme to go into survival mode, so to speak, as he did somewhat against Kareem Mayfield, and as the way he attempted to do it against Luis Abregu in his only loss as a professional. That being said, it seemed as though Delorme was able to hold on just enough, box well enough, just enough down the stretch, and picked up a very close win. However, while the cards might suggest there was a wider fight, in the end it was the knockdown in the first round that Delorme scored against Lundy that made that gap a little bigger. It was, again, a close fight. That being said, going forward, it's difficult to see what Lundy can do. He fights at about 135 to 140 pounds for most of his career, and he has seemed to come up just a bit short in both divisions, whereas Delorme seems like a good enough fighter for 4 to 5 rounds maybe, but then seems to fall apart a bit in the fight as the fight progresses. So it's one of those situations where it's hard to see where he can go. That being said, he could be one of those fighters that could win a couple of interesting fights if you put him in at the right time against the right guy. And at the very least, you'll see what the other guy has, someone like a Chris Algieri if he's coming back down to 140 more permanently, or even if Delorme were to take on someone like Ruslan Provodnikov. It might be an idea of, it might give you an idea of how Provodnikov can deal with a boxer that will probably not be durable enough to keep Provodnikov off him the entire fight. So it's difficult to try and chart out a very successful path for Delorme, but it's nonetheless a couple of interesting fights could be out there. Then in the second fight we had Hugo Centenos taking on James De La Rosa. De La Rosa was coming off the big win against James Kirkland, but in this case it was all for naught, as Centeno was able to time his shots pretty well, box from range, use a jab, and then catch De La Rosa coming in with an overhand left that pretty much ended matters altogether in the fight. Undefeated Hugo is, so it's interesting to see where he could go in the middleweight division. He's a lanky guy, a wiry guy. He seems to have a decent bit of power in his punches, but at the same time he seems like a guy who might have a few things missing or still need to be developed. In the end, it'll be interesting again to see where he goes, but you're not totally sure of him just yet. Maybe, interestingly enough, a fight against the likes of Gabriel Rosado makes sense for him at some point down the line. I'm not necessarily saying in his next fight, but that sort of fight could tell us a bit more about him than the De La Rosa fight did. But it's certainly an interesting prospect/contender to look out for. To get to the main event, we had David Lemieux, as mentioned, against Gabriel Rosado. Both fighters sort of needing that win. Rosado to prove that he can win at this level. Lemieux to prove that he belongs at the level at all, in effect. I mean, Rosado's always been competitive, but you wanted to know if he could make it stick. Whereas Lemieux, every time he seemed to test the sort of deeper waters, seemed to struggle for air. So it was one of those kind of fights, and Lemieux seemed to grasp the opportunity with both hands. He came out firing, he hurt Rosado with a hard shot, and he also blinded him effectively in the left eye in the second round, and it dropped Rosado, who seemed to sort of fall to the canvas, both from being hurt and also from having damage to the eye, and that ultimately led to the stoppage in the 10th round. Lemieux continued to pick up the points, pound at the body, land hard shots up top as well, and Rosado seemed to have moments, even in the 7th, 8th, 9th rounds, but it wasn't going to be enough against Lemieux, who seemed to be able to take the shots, paced himself better, and of course had enough power in his own shots to keep Rosado honest, and a bit too honest for his own good effectively, because he probably had to sell out in that fight at some point and just wasn't able to because of an accumulation of things. So in the end, it was a good stoppage by the officials at ringside, and the fight was waved off midway through the 10th. Rosado, again, going forward, it's very difficult to see what he might be able to do. He has, again, as I mentioned, seemed to come up short in those bigger fights. but at the same time, he's still probably too good to just be considered a gatekeeper or a journeyman completely. He certainly has some worth, and it's not the craziest thing in the world to call a Rosado upset against many of the middleweights, or junior middleweights for that matter, out there. Doesn't mean he's going to beat them all, but he certainly has a live chance in most of those fights. For Lemieux, it seems as though HBO's interested in the idea of matching him up against Gennady Golovkin next year if Golovkin, of course, gets past Martin Murray in February and can't lock up one of those bigger, more interesting fights later in the year. And to be honest with you, it's an interesting fight. I'd like to watch it. Both guys can bang a bit. Lemieux, of course, seems to be the less complete fighter, but that certainly doesn't stop me from finding that fight to be quite interesting. And the fact of the matter is, it would be interesting to see Golovkin in there with another guy, young, hungry, who can bang, and see what happens there. It would be a pretty interesting fight, and he's a big middleweight as well. So, could be an interesting fight, could happen next year, and that's the sort of thing that a win on HBO will do for you. It gives you plenty of sort of options. Of course, they come with their own set of danger, but it's an interesting fight nonetheless. In any event, tell me your thoughts on the fight. What'd you think? Who'd you have winning Delorme versus Lundy? What'd you think of the winners and the losers? Tell me all of your thoughts, of course, and what you think they'll be doing in the future. You can do that in the comments section below and on Twitter at 12rounderboxing. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. Visit 12rounder.com. And until next time, enjoy the fights.